Hello, this is Tessa Kegel and this is HBSOHC Module10bPart1of2 and it is Identifying and Controlling Hazards, Mitigation of Health Impacts, Occupational Epidemiology. This is the Commonwealth of Australia Copyright Act 1968, which covers this series of lectures. So, the objectives of this module are that on completion of this module, you should be able to access, interpret and synthesize the application of research information to the mitigation of health effects of hazards in the workplace. Identify the appropriate requirements for and use of expert assistance to assist with the application of hazardous substance-related health research in the workplace. Articulate the basic principles of epidemiologically based evidence in relation to the protection of workers from the effects of hazardous substances. Appropriately synthesize and apply research to inform decision-making for the development, evaluation and maintenance of a safe system for prevention of health impacts of hazardous substances exposures. Epidemiology is the study of the distribution and patterns of health events, health characteristics, and their causes or influences in well-defined populations. Epidemiology helps inform policy decisions and evidence-based medicine interventions by identifying risk factors for disease, targets for preventive medicine, and public health policies. Epidemiological studies underpin our understanding of the effects of working environments on people in the workplace. When you want more information on substance of interest or an understanding about an OHS issue, the epidemiological literature will assist you with your understanding. You might have an outbreak of Legionella in your workplace. Epidemiological literature will cover the history of outbreaks, the methodologies used to detect the infecting bacterium, causal factors, the different types of Legionella bacterium and the outcomes of testing procedures, and the impact of interventions on the affected populations. Building on this learning, applied OHS literature will then pursue the preventive and management techniques that have developed as a result of its understanding of the process. In this module, we review the use of epidemiology research to underpin strategic OHS interventions and reviews. We touch very briefly on the various study designs and the literature of OCEPI. This module is intended as a very brief introduction, as the literature on OCEPI is extensive and takes many years to understand. Epidemiological studies. Epidemiology is used to measure the health and illness or mortality and morbidity in populations. Epidemiology may be defined as the study of the distribution and determinants of disease in populations. And this is from Christie et al. 1995. An epidemiologist works with populations, not individuals, to gain a history of diseases or occurrences, to develop and evaluate strategies in the prevention of disease and order priorities of resource allocation in healthcare. The World Health Organization defines epidemiology in occupational health as having the dual task of describing the distribution of deaths, accidents, illnesses, and their causes in the human population, and of searching for the determinants of health, injury, and disease in the occupational environment. The complexity of working environments and the often unmeasured exposures of workers to particular hazards has led to difficulties quantifying the outcomes of these exposures. Issues of the present, such as human exposure to overhead power sources, mobile telephones, or nanotechnology, require careful scientific evaluation. Along with physical measures and environmental monitoring, epidemiology leads us to the human effects. Studies can be as wide as national studies of the effects of particular chemical exposure, job or work environment, to the narrow evaluation of a particular compound with a defined group of workers. In this module, we address work-related epidemiology with particular reference to chemical and biological hazards. There are a range of epidemiological study designs, and they increase in their strength or research rigour from a simple ecological study to the prevalence and cross-sectional studies to case control or case reference studies to longitudinal, usually known as cohort studies, and then finally to the most rigorous types of study designs, the randomised controlled trials, the cluster randomised controlled trials, and field trials in the community. This figure below gives a neat summary of the various types of study designs. So first of all, you have your observational study, where the researcher just observes what's taking place within the population. So these can be descriptive studies or analytical studies. And as I said, this consists of ecological studies, which are correlational and look at populations, cross-sectional studies, which consider the prevalence of a specific condition and uses as the unit of study an individual, case control studies, also known as case reference studies, which again uses the unit of study uses the individual as the unit of study, and cohort studies, which are also called follow-up studies, and again uses the individual as the unit of study. Then we have the more experimental designs, which include randomized control trials, cluster randomized control trials, where you consider groups instead of individuals in terms of your intervention, field trials, and community trials. And a community trial is really trying to see if an intervention trying to detect the effects of an intervention within an entire community. So first of all, we'll consider some studies of descriptive epidemiology. Surveys of prevalence, or cross-sectional surveys, only look at a particular moment at time, or a snapshot of a particular event. Therefore, it's not possible to draw any cause or effect relationships. They do, however, show the pattern of what is happening across occupations and industries and frequently reveal possible associations which suggest the need for further research. They, in fact, make up the basis for reporting systems which are found in occupational health and safety systems. A really important factor when calculating measures of disease frequency is the correct estimate of the number of people under study. Ideally, these numbers should only include people who are potentially susceptible to the diseases being studied. For instance, men should not be included when calculating the frequency of cervical cancer, as you can see in figure 2.1 below. So we have the total population, which includes all men and all women, and then we have women divided into age groups, 0 to 24, 25 to 69, and 70 plus years. And we define the population at risk as being women aged between 25 to 69 years. So the people who are susceptible to a given disease are called the population at risk and can be defined by demographic, geographic, or environmental factors. For instance, occupational injuries occur only among working people, so the population at risk is the workforce. In some countries, brucellosis only occurs amongst people handling infected animals, so the population at risk consists of those working in farms and in slaughterhouses. Incidence and prevalence. Studies can measure incidence or prevalence. Incidence is the number of new cases occurring in a defined population over a specific period of time. It's usually expressed as a rate of the number of cases per thousand of the population under study. The importance of incidence is in the measure of what is going on at a time in the comparison with other periods of time. This can illustrate the rise and fall of an epidemic. In the community, this may be an infectious disease, or in the workplace, an indicator of the outcome of particular hazards. Prevalence is the number of cases which exists in a defined population at any given time or at a point over a period of time. Prevalence is a measure of the cost to a community and assists with planning services and facilities. For example, if we know the prevalence of HIV in the community, we can plan for the services which people might need over the next however many years. Prevalence rates can be influenced by many factors. The OHS practitioner should be mindful of these factors when reading material which gets prevalence rates. This figure goes into a little bit of detail about some of the factors which might influence prevalence. So first of all, we have the severity of the illness. If many people who develop a disease die within a short time, its prevalence is decreased. The duration of illness. If a disease lasts a short time, its prevalence is lower than if it lasts a long time. The number of new cases. If many people develop a disease, its prevalence is higher than if a few people do so. So factors influencing prevalence, it may be increased by longer duration of the disease, prolongation of life of patients without cure, increase in new cases, so this is an increase in incidence, in-migration of cases, out-migration of healthy people, in-migration of susceptible people, and improved diagnostic facilities, as in better reporting. It might be decreased by shorter duration of the disease, high case fatality rate from disease, decrease in new cases, so it's a decrease in incidence, in-migration of healthy people, out-migration of cases, or improved cure rate of cases. Rates. Rates of occurrence of morbidity or mortality can be measured in the community. For example, death rates, birth rates, infant mortality rates, perinatal mortality rates, rates of hypertension, or musculoskeletal symptoms. Paradoxically, these rates are all said to measure the health of a community. However, when we consider the death rates for a country such as Australia compared to a country such as East Timor, this will become clear. Rates can also be compared between cities and country. For example, the rates of disease in Indigenous communities compared to non-Indigenous communities, or for specific diseases over time. These rates can then be used to set the objectives for health improvements for whatever group. For example, to reduce the number of Australians under 70 dying of heart disease by 20% by the year 2005. Rates cannot be compared if they are not standardised. Particularly the death rate rises with ageing, therefore it might appear that people in older established suburbs die more than those in new housing estates, when in reality this only represents the age groups in these new suburbs. Prevalence rates must be age standardised and sometimes gender standardised. A standardised morbidity or mortality rate, or an SMR, is then able to be calculated. SMR is calculated from the observed cases divided by the expected cases. There are direct and indirect methods of standardisation. This table presents some more information about the differences between incidence and prevalence. So first of all, we have incidence. So in the numerator, there are the number of new cases of disease during a specific period of time. And the denominator is the population at risk, which we've already described. So the focus of this is whether the event is a new case, and it considers the time of onset of the disease. So incidence rates are used to express the risk of becoming ill and the main measure of acute diseases or conditions, but it's also used for chronic diseases, and it's more useful for studies of causation. And then we have prevalence, where the numerator consists of the number of existing cases of disease at a particular point in time. And the denominator, once again, is the population at risk. So the focus is the presence or absence of a disease, and the time period is arbitrary rather than a specific snapshot in time. So its uses are to estimate the probability of becoming ill in a period of time which is being studied. And it's useful in the study of the burden of chronic diseases and implications for health services. Relative risk and attributable risk. Relative risk of a disease is the risk of a condition occurring relative to the exposed population compared to the rate amongst those in the population who are not exposed, or a ratio of the probability of an event occurring in the exposed group versus a non-exposed group. As a rule of thumb, a larger than 3-to-1 ratio usually indicates a statistically significant difference. Relative risk, however, does not describe the magnitude of the problem. Attributable risk is the difference in rates of a condition between an exposed and a non-exposed population. Thus, the potential number of people with the disease in a population can then be calculated for purposes such as to assist with planning services for that population.